My stepdaughter introduced me to the mother of her future husband at the engagement dinner in Vienna as the man who manages things at home. She said it while looking at the tablecloth, not at me, with the practiced lightness of someone who has rehearsed a sentence many times and has decided that the rehearsal has produced the right version. The mother of the future husband was a woman named Frau Bergmann, and she was the director of a cultural foundation, and she wore her social ease the way certain Viennese women do, completely and without apparent effort. And she smiled at me and said how lovely and extended her hand. And I shook it and said nothing beyond my name. Valentina moved the conversation forward immediately. She was good at moving conversations forward. She had been a lecturer in art history at the university for 6 years. And she had the professional capacity of someone who manages rooms full of people who are only partially paying attention, and who has learned to navigate the partial attention with practiced energy. She deployed this capacity now, turning to Frau Bergmann with a comment about the Cultural Foundation's recent exhibition program, and the conversation moved, and I stood in it, and I continued to be the man who manages things at home. The dinner was in the private room of a hotel in the first district. There were 22 people present, divided between Valentina's side, which was Hannah and me, and a small group of her university colleagues, and her closest friend from Berlin, and Felix's side, which was his parents and his brother, and a collection of Viennese family friends, who had the specific, ambient quality of people who have known each other for a generation, and who communicate their history in a language of reference and assumption that outsiders cannot fully access. Felix himself was tall and pleasant, and clearly anxious, in the way of men at engagement parties, aware that something important is happening that they cannot entirely control. He had good manners and a genuine quality about him that I had noticed in our 2 previous meetings and that I considered important. The good manners were learned, but the genuine quality was not, and the combination was the best available combination. I drank my wine. I ate my food. I spoke to the people near me. I was present in the room, in the way I am present in rooms, which is attentively and without particular claim on the attention of others. And I thought about what Valentina had said, and what it meant, and what, if anything, I was going to do about it. I want to describe the interior experience of the engagement dinner, because the interior experience is where this story actually lives, and the interior experience is not the sequence of events that I have outlined above, but the specific quality of thinking that occurred while those events were happening. I was thinking about buildings. This is what I do when I need to think about something difficult, which is to think through an architectural analogy, because architecture is the language in which I can think most precisely. I was thinking about a specific engineering problem that I had encountered many years earlier in the design of a long-span roof structure, a problem in which the visible surface of the roof gave no indication of the complexity of the structure that supported it. The visitors to the completed building experienced a simple, clean, generous overhead plane. What was behind that plane was an engineering solution of considerable ingenuity that had required 3 months of intensive structural calculation and several iterations before it was right. The simplicity was the result of the complexity, not the absence of it. I was thinking about this because the engagement dinner was a specific version of this problem. Valentina was presenting me to the Bergmanns as a simple surface, the man who manages things at home. This surface was not false in the sense of being invented. It was simply the visible plane of something that had a great deal of structure behind it, and she did not know what was behind it, and had therefore presented only the visible plane. The presentation was a consequence of her not knowing the structure, not of her inventing a false surface. This understanding did not remove the discomfort of the moment, but it changed its shape, and changing the shape was useful. I was also thinking about what 20 years of presence and funding and engagement had produced, in terms of Valentina's understanding of who I was. The answer that the engagement dinner was producing was very little in certain crucial dimensions. She knew I had a practice. She knew we had a comfortable life. She did not know the dimensions of the practice, or the dimensions of the life, or the dimensions of the professional reputation that I had built over 3 decades. She knew I had helped with the mathematics homework and driven to school events and paid the school fees and funded foreigns in Berlin and Vienna. She did not know, apparently, that these things were done from a position of professional distinction rather than comfortable adequacy. This raised the question of whether I had failed to make myself known. The question had two answers, both of which were true simultaneously. The first was that a person who has a genuine relationship with another person over 20 years and who asks no questions that reveal an interest in the professional dimensions of that person's life has not earned the full account of those dimensions. The second was that I had perhaps not offered the account even in contexts where offering it would have been appropriate, because my nature is the nature of someone who does not announce themselves and who trusts that presence is sufficient communication. The first answer was Valentina's responsibility. The second was mine. Both were true. I drank more of the wine. I spoke to the person on my left, a Vienna art dealer, who knew Valentina from the university world, and who had intelligent things to say about the current state of the public architecture discourse in Austria. I was a useful conversation partner for him, and he was a useful conversation partner for me, and the conversation was good, in the way that conversations with knowledgeable strangers at formal dinners can be good, which is fully engaged and with a genuine finish line, because you know the conversation will end when the evening does. On the way back to the hotel, after the dinner, I was decided. My name is Werner Hoffmann. I am 68 years old. I was born in Munich in 1956, the son of a civil engineer and a pianist, which is a combination of parents that produces in the children. It generates either a severe internal conflict or a specific synthesis, and in my case, it produced the synthesis. I studied architecture at the Technical University of Munich, and then worked for 7 years in a large architectural firm in Frankfurt, before leaving in 1990 to found my own practice with two partners. The practice Hoffmann Bauer Steinmeier grew over 35 years into something I would characterize without either false modesty or immodesty as one of the more significant architectural practices in the German-speaking world in the area of institutional and educational buildings. We have designed 11 university buildings, 4 hospitals, 2 concert halls, and a national library, among other projects. I was awarded the German Architecture Prize in 2014. My work has been exhibited at the Venice Architecture Biennale on 2 separate occasions. I want to describe what building an architectural practice over 35 years actually requires, because the description is relevant to understanding everything else in this story, and because the description is rarely given accurately by people who are outside the process. Architecture, as most people understand it, is about the visible product, the building. What architecture actually requires is the capacity to translate a problem that has not yet been solved into a structure that solves it without the solution being visible as such. The best buildings are the ones in which the problem and the solution have become so fully integrated that the problem is no longer apparent to the person inside the building. They experience the solution without ever needing to understand the problem that preceded it. This requires a specific quality of thinking that is neither purely technical nor purely aesthetic, but something that lives in the space between them. And it requires this quality to be applied consistently over the years that a building takes to move from the first conversation with a client to the moment when the last detail of the fit-out is complete and the building opens and people walk through the door for the first time. I built Hoffmann Bauer Steinmeier on this understanding. In the early years, when the 3 of us were doing everything ourselves, in an office in a former textile warehouse in Schwabing, that we could barely afford, we worked on small commissions, private houses and renovations, and the occasional small commercial project. And we were rigorous in all of them. I have always believed that the quality of the small work determines the quality of the large work, because the habits of precision and care and honesty that you form in small commissions are the habits you bring to large ones, and you cannot acquire them by skipping the small work and going directly to the large. I learned this from my father's kitchen table, and I have never found a reason to doubt it. The institutional commissions began in the late 90s. A school library in Augsburg, that received a regional architecture award. A faculty building at a polytechnic in Nuremberg that was the subject of a professional journal piece and that produced the connection to the university administration that led eventually to the University Commission. By 2005, we had a staff of 20 and projects in 3 countries, and a reputation that was in the specific circles where reputation in European institutional architecture is formed and evaluated, solid and growing. By 2015, the year after the Architecture Prize, we had 43 staff and the completed list that I described above, and a forward project book that extended 5 years into the future. I met Hannah in 1999. She was 36 years old, and she had been divorced from Valentina's father for 2 years, and Valentina was 11 and about to become 12, which is the specific age at which a child is both entirely formed and entirely unfinished, when the person they will become is legible in outline but not yet in detail. Hannah was a music teacher at a secondary school in Munich, which is how we met at an event at the school, where my firm had been commissioned to design an extension to the music wing, one of those public architecture commissions that require engagement with the client institution and that I have always valued, because they put you in conversation with people who use buildings rather than people who commission them. Hannah played piano at the school, as her mother had done, and she had her mother's quality of presence at a piano, which is the quality of someone who is not performing at the instrument, but simply living inside it. We married in 2002 when Valentina was 14. The wedding was small, and the marriage became over the following years the central organizing fact of my personal life. I had not been married before. I had been, for the previous 15 years, someone whose professional life was sufficiently consuming that the personal life had remained in a state of productive incompletion. Not unhappily, but simply as a consequence of the specific allocation of energy that building a practice requires. Hannah reorganized this. She did it without reorganizing it deliberately, simply by being the person she was, in the proximity of the person I was, and the two things arranged themselves around each other in a way that felt both natural and inevitable. Valentina was another matter, or rather Valentina was the same matter approached from a different angle. She was 14 when I came into her life as a permanent, rather than visiting presence, and 14 is the age at which the fundamental suspicion of any adult who is not a biological parent reaches its full professional expression. She was not hostile. She was assessing. She, in the careful way of an intelligent child, who has learned that adults are not always what they say they are, and who has decided to find out what this particular one is before committing to any position. I respected the assessment. I submitted to it with the patience that it deserved, which is the patience of someone who understands that trust is built by consistency over time and not by assertion or performance. By the time Valentina was 17, we had arrived at something that was genuine. Not the relationship of a father and a daughter in the biological sense, but something that I came to understand was its own thing, specific to the configuration that had produced it, and not diminished by comparison to other configurations. I helped with the mathematics and the physics homework that were giving her difficulty. I attended the school events that Hannah could not attend because her own schedule conflicted. I drove her to the places she needed to go and listened to the things she was thinking about and asked questions about them, because I was genuinely interested in what she was thinking about, even when what she was thinking about was things I knew nothing about, which was frequently the case. I learned more about the history of Renaissance patronage than I had previously known from following Valentina's developing interest in the subject, and I found it more interesting than I had expected. I want to describe the specific texture of those years of building the relationship, because the texture matters for understanding what the engagement dinner represented and why it landed as it did. There was a period when Valentina was 15 in the second year of the gymnasium, when she was struggling with the physical structure of scientific thought, with the specific requirement to understand why something is true rather than simply to learn that it is. She had always been more comfortable with the interpretive than with the foundational, more comfortable explaining what something meant than demonstrating why it was necessarily so. I recognize this difficulty because it is a difficulty I had encountered in my own education at the specific transition between knowing and understanding, and I had found my way through it by means that were available to an architect's son who grew up around drawings. I taught her through drawings. I showed her how to represent a mathematical relationship, spatially how to see the proof in the geometry rather than in the algebra alone, and this worked because her mind had the spatial quality that art history would later confirm, and that mathematics had been presenting to her in an inaccessible form. Over 3 weeks of evenings at the kitchen table in Munich, she moved from failing to understand to understanding, and the understanding, once achieved, was solid and transferable. And when her grades in mathematics improved significantly in the following term, she told Hannah that I had helped her, and Hannah came and found me in the study and said nothing for a moment, and then said, "Thank you," and that was all. There were the Florence months, the year she spent in Italy, after her abitur, developing the eye for the built environment that her subsequent career would require. She called me twice a week from Florence, which surprised me because it was not a pattern I had expected. The calls were not calls for help or for money, but for conversation, for the specific conversation that the particular setting was generating in her, because she was seeing things she had not seen before, and she wanted to talk about them. And I was the person in her life who had the specific knowledge that allowed the conversations to go somewhere. We talked about the Brunelleschi dome and about the structural logic of the Quattrocento hospital facade, and about the specific quality of light in Alberti's Sant'Andrea in Mantua that she had made a day trip to see. These were the conversations I had not expected to have with her, and that I valued the most, because they were the conversations where she was fully present, with no management in them. The conversations of someone who is discovering something and who wants to share the discovery with a person they believe can receive it. There were the Berlin years of the doctorate, which I funded with the same plainness with which I had funded everything, and during which I visited once a year for a weekend. And we would go to buildings together, buildings I had professional interest in or that she had academic interest in. And we would walk through them and discuss them in the way that architects and art historians can discuss buildings when both are genuinely looking at the same thing. She had a quality of looking that I recognized from the good students I had been around in my professional training, the quality of someone who does not see what they expect to see, but what is actually there, who has trained the expectation out of the perception and left only the observation. This quality was genuine, and it was hers, and it was the quality that would make her a good scholar. Her biological father, Marcus Gruber, was present in her life, with the inconsistency that characterizes fathers who are not where their children are. He meant to do better than he managed, which is the specific failure mode of people who substitute intention for presence and who find when they look back that the children grew without them despite the intentions. Valentina's relationship with Marcus was, by the time she reached adulthood, a relationship of obligation rather than depth, the obligation of a daughter toward a father who was her father in the genetic sense and not much else. She had told me this herself once when she was 23 and had come back from a weekend visit to Marcus and his new family that had been from her account. A study in the specific discomfort of a woman who does not fully belong to the place she is visiting and who does not know how to address this directly. She had sat in the kitchen and drunk tea and been quiet about it in the way of someone who has processed something difficult and is not yet sure what they think. I had not offered interpretation. I had made the tea and sat with her. I paid for her education. I want to say this plainly because it is a plain fact that is relevant to the story. I paid the school fees for the private gymnasium where Hannah had wanted her to study, and that was beyond what Hannah's teacher's salary could sustain. I paid for the year in Florence that Valentina had wanted after her abitur, and that had become, in retrospect, the year that formed the adult version of her. I paid for the Berlin apartment during the doctorate and the subsequent years of establishing herself as a lecturer at the Vienna University. I paid because I had the resources to pay, and because the payment enabled things that were worth enabling, and because I am not a person who withholds resources from the people in my life, when the withholding would serve no purpose beyond the demonstration of a principle I do not hold. None of this was displayed. I have never displayed anything. It is not my nature, which is the nature of someone trained in architecture, the discipline of making things that work correctly and that are honest about what they are, without being theatrical about their honesty. A building that announces its structure is a building that has confused the structure for the content. The structure is what makes the content possible. The content is what matters. My professional life and my personal life have both been organized around this understanding. Valentina knew we were comfortable. She knew I had a successful practice. She knew the Munich house was a good house, and that the Vienna apartment I used during the years when the practice had significant Austrian projects was not a modest apartment. She did not know the specific dimensions of what I had built over 35 years, because I had not told her and because she had not asked, which is itself the answer to a question about how closely she had been attending to the specific dimensions of who I was. At the engagement dinner, she introduced me as the man who manages things at home. I thought about this on the way back to the hotel after the dinner. Hannah was beside me in the taxi and she was quiet, which told me she was also thinking about it. She had heard the introduction. She was the kind of person who hears everything in a room, which is a quality musicians develop from a lifetime of listening to what is happening in sound around them. She heard it, and she said nothing at the dinner. And she was saying nothing in the taxi, and I let her say nothing, because the nothing was full and did not need to be disturbed. At the hotel, when we were in the room, she said, "Werner." I said, "Yes." She said, "I need to apologize for what she said." I said, "You have nothing to apologize for." She said, "She is my daughter." I said, "She is 41 years old, and she made a choice. The choice is hers." She said it was unkind. I said it was thoughtless, which is a different thing. She said, "Does the difference matter?" I thought about this. I said, "Yes. Thoughtlessness can be corrected. Contempt is a different problem." She said, "You do not think it was contempt." I said, "I think she did not know what to say because she does not know who I am, and the space where knowledge would have been was filled with the most neutral available description." She said, "The man who manages things at home," I said, which is also accurate in a limited way. She looked at me. She said, "Werner, you are being more generous about this than you should be." I said, "I am being accurate about it. That is different from generous." She said, "Are you going to do something?" I said, "I have been planning something for some time." She said, "The announcement." I said, "Yes." She said, "You were going to make the announcement in January." I said, "I am going to make it in December. A week from now." She said, "Because of tonight." I said, "Because of tonight, yes." She said, "Is that the right reason?" I thought about it. I said, the announcement was going to be made regardless. What tonight changed was the timing. She said, "And the purpose." I said, "The purpose is the same purpose it has always been. The timing is what tonight changed." She said, "And the effect?" I said, "Yes, and the effect." She said, "Are you going to do something?" I said, "I have been planning something for some time." She said, "The announcement." I said, "Yes." She said, "You were going to make the announcement in January." I said, "I am going to make it in December. A week from now." She said, "Because of tonight." I said, "Because of tonight, yes." She said, "Is that the right reason?" I thought about it. I said, the announcement was going to be made regardless. What tonight changed was the timing. She said, "And the purpose." I said, the purpose is the same purpose it has always been. The timing is what tonight changed. She said, "And the effect?" I said, "Yes, and the effect." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Tell me what you are planning." So I told her, "I need to tell you more about the foundation's development than the brief account I gave Hannah that night, because the development is the part that contains the thing I find most important about this whole story, which is the process by which an idea becomes something real when you are patient enough with it." I had been thinking about the problem of access to architecture education for more than a decade before the engagement dinner. The thinking had begun, as most professional thinking begins, with an observation in practice. We had over many years hired from a remarkably similar pool of candidates. Graduate architects from the major technical universities, the children, largely of professionals, the products of private secondary schools in university towns, people whose formative environments had been ones of relative stability and educational investment. This was not a policy. It was simply the consequence of where the candidates came from. And the candidates came from where they came from, because the pathway into architecture was long and expensive, and the support structures for people who could not absorb the cost were inadequate. I knew from my own background that the aptitude for architectural thinking was not concentrated in the social groups from which we recruited. I'd grown up in a middle-class professional household, but I'd been aware since my training of the specific waste that occurred when people who had the spatial intelligence and the technical capacity for architectural work were directed, by circumstance rather than by choice, into work that did not use those capacities. I had seen it in the construction industry, where skilled tradespeople would occasionally reveal in conversation a quality of spatial understanding that belonged in design rooms rather than on site, and who had arrived on site because the pathway to the design room had not been visible to them when the choices were made. The foundation plan began as a conversation with a colleague, a woman named Professor Heidrun Meyer at the ETH Zurich, who had been thinking about similar questions from the academic side and who had been involved in a small bursary program at Zurich that was producing results she found promising. We had lunch in 2019 at a conference in Basel, and the conversation had gone in the direction that conversations go when two people are thinking about the same problem from different positions and discover the complementarity. By the end of the lunch, we had the outline of something that was larger than what either of us had been developing separately. The legal and financial work had taken 3 years. Dr. Voss, my lawyer, was meticulous about the foundation structure, which needed to be sound in 3 jurisdictions because the partner institutions were in Germany, Austria, and Switzerland. The endowment calculation went through 7 iterations before settling on 5 million as the appropriate initial figure, a number that was large enough to provide genuine stability and small enough to be genuinely personal rather than institutional. The governance board selection had been the most time-consuming element, because the board needed to combine sector expertise with the practical wisdom of people who had worked at the intersection of education and professional life, rather than purely within either. The press release went out on a Friday morning. I was in Munich at the practice when the communications firm we had engaged sent the confirmation that it had been distributed. The concept was simple in outline and complex in execution, as most significant educational initiatives are: to create funded pathways into architectural and construction design education for young people from less privileged backgrounds who had demonstrated aptitude and whose access to the profession was limited by financial and social barriers. The profession was, in my experience of it over 35 years, one of the more socially homogeneous in Germany and Austria, recruited substantially from a narrow demographic base, and therefore missing significant talent that was present in the population, but not in the pool from which architectural practices drew. This was not a novel observation, but it was an observation with persistent practical consequences that I had been thinking about for a long time, and that I had decided in my early 60s. I was in a position to do something concrete about. I had been working with a legal and financial team for 3 years building the structure. The foundation would be capitalized with an initial endowment of 5 million euros funded from my personal resources, and would partner with the Technical University of Munich, the Technical University of Vienna, and 3 regional polytechnic institutions to provide bursaries, mentoring, and structured placement programs. The governance board included 2 retired senior architects from respected European practices, a professor of architecture from Zurich, and a woman who ran a community design organization in Hamburg that worked specifically in socially disadvantaged areas. I was the founding chair. The public announcement had been planned for January. It was now going to be made at the end of the first week of December. Hannah listened to all of this. She had heard most of it before, because we had talked about the foundation as it developed, but she had not heard the full assembled version in one telling. When I finished, she said, "And the press release reaches Vienna when?" I said, "It will be picked up by the Austrian architectural press within a day of the German release." She said, "And the Bergmans will see it." I said, "They will see it." She said, "And Valentina?" I said, "Yes." She said, "When she calls?" I said, "When she calls." She said, "What will you say?" I said, "I will say what is true." She said, "Which is?" I said, "That the foundation exists because it should exist. That the timing of the announcement is what changed this week. That I am glad she called because I would like to speak to her." She said, "Werner." I said, "Yes." She said, "She has no idea." I said, "No." She said, "She genuinely has no idea who you are." I said, "No." She said, "That is partly my fault." I said, "It is not your fault." She said, "I could have told her more." I said, "She could have asked more." She said, "You are right." She said, "Both things are true." I said, "Yes, both things are true." The press release went out on a Friday morning. I was in Munich at the practice when the communications firm we had engaged sent the confirmation that it had been distributed. The release was 4 paragraphs, well written, precise in the way of professional announcements in our sector. It described the foundation's purpose and structure, identified the partner institutions, named the governance board, and specified the initial endowment. The final paragraph described the founder in terms that were accurate and that were for anyone who knew the architectural world in Germany and Austria recognizable: the German Architecture Prize, the Biennale appearances, the institutional buildings and the concert halls and the library, the things I had built. I went back to the project. I had been reviewing a hospital extension in Leipzig that had been presenting structural challenges in the roof configuration, and I worked until lunchtime. At lunch, I went to the cafe across the street that I had been going to for lunch for 20 years, and I ate and read the newspaper and did not think about the press release or about Vienna. Valentina called on the following Tuesday. I had expected this, and I had also prepared for it to not happen, because you cannot rely on the outcomes you expect from other people's responses to information they were not ready to receive. She called at 10:30 in the morning, which told me she had been thinking about it since she had seen it, and had decided to call when she was ready rather than when she had first seen it, which was, I thought, a good sign about the quality of the call. I was in the office when she called. I answered on the second ring. She said, "Werner." Her voice had a quality I recognized from the times when she was preparing to say something difficult. A controlled quality, the quality of someone who has composed themselves in advance. I said, "Valentina." She said, "I saw the press release." I said, "Yes." She said, "And I read the article in the Architecture Journal." I said, "Ah." She said, "They included your full profile." I said, "I know." She said, "The Biennale, the Architecture Prize, the library." I said, "Yes." She said, "I did not know." I said, "No." She said, "Werner, why did you never tell me?" I said, "Tell you what specifically?" She said, "Any of it." I said, "You never asked." She said, "That is." She stopped. She said, "That is fair." She was quiet for a moment. I waited. I had learned over 20 years of being in a professional world, where the important information is often delivered with a delay, to wait without filling the waiting with noise. She said, "At the dinner, the engagement dinner." I said, "Yes." She said, "I introduced you as." She stopped. She said, "I did not know what to say." I said, "I know." She said, "That is not an excuse." I said, "No." She said, "I chose the easiest description, and it was the wrong description, and I did it in front of people who were making assessments, and it was." She stopped again. She said it was dismissive. I said, "Yes." She said, "I am sorry, Werner." She said it in the register of someone who means it, not the register of someone who is managing the situation. I have spent enough time in rooms with people managing situations to know the difference. I said, "I appreciate that." She said, "Can I ask you something?" I said, "Yes." She said, "The foundation. Is it?" She stopped. She said, "Is the timing of the announcement related to what happened at the dinner?" I thought about honesty. I said the foundation was going to be announced in January. The dinner moved the announcement to December. She said, "So yes." I said, "Yes." She said, "And you wanted me to know who you are before the announcement, rather than discovering it after the announcement." I said, "I wanted you to have the information. What you did with it was your decision." She said, "But you wanted me to have it." I said, "Yes." She was quiet again. Then she said, "I have not been attending, have I?" I said, "To what specifically?" She said, "To you. To who you are." I said, you have been attending to your own life, which is the appropriate thing to be attending to. She said, that is generous. I said, it is accurate. She said, you keep saying that. I said, I keep meaning it. She said, Werner. I said, yes, she said. Would you come to Vienna? Would you and Hannah come to dinner at our apartment? I said, yes. She said, next weekend. I said, yes. The dinner at the Vienna apartment was the dinner that the engagement evening had not been. They had cooked together, Valentina and Felix, which was itself a statement about the seriousness with which they had prepared for the evening. Felix was warm in the way that good people are warm when they have understood that something important is happening and that their warmth is one of the things that makes it possible. He asked me about the foundation, which told me Valentina had told him about it, and had told him in a way that gave him genuine context. Because the questions he asked were not the questions of someone who has been briefed to ask questions, but of someone who is genuinely interested in the answers. We ate and we talked for 4 hours. I want to describe the 4 hours because they were 4 hours of a quality I do not often have, which is the quality of a conversation in which something is genuinely changing as the conversation proceeds, in which the people in the conversation are arriving at understanding together, rather than presenting positions to each other. Felix asked about the technical education gap and about how the foundation was addressing it specifically. He was a lawyer, and he thought in the way lawyers think, which is to identify the mechanism by which a problem operates, and then to look for the mechanism by which it can be addressed. And the questions he asked were sharp and useful. I answered them fully because they deserved full answers, and because I wanted to be in a conversation of this quality for as long as it was available. Valentina was quieter in the first part of the evening than she usually was, which I noticed, and which I understood to be the quiet of someone who is processing something, rather than the quiet of someone who has nothing to say. She asked good questions when she asked them the questions of someone who had been reading about the subject since Tuesday, as she had told me she had. At some point in the middle of the evening, she asked about the historical models for this kind of institutional patronage, which was a question from her area of expertise, and I said, tell me what you know about them. And she did. She spoke for about 15 minutes about the Medici patronage model and about the German Werkbund and about the Bauhaus funding structure and about several contemporary examples she had researched. And the analysis was good, better than good. It was the analysis of someone who understood the problem in its historical dimension, and who was connecting the historical dimension to the contemporary one with genuine precision. When she finished, I said, that is exactly the kind of analysis the governance board lacks. She looked at me. I said, not as a compliment, as an assessment. She said, I know the difference. I said, yes. She said, then yes. She said, I want to be useful to this. I said, you already are. At some point in the evening, after Felix had gone to deal with something in another room, with the thoughtfulness of someone who understands that there are conversations that benefit from privacy, Valentina and I were at the kitchen table with the wine and the specific quiet of an evening that has reached the point where the important things can be said. She said, I want to ask you something that you can say no to. I said, ask. She said, the Foundation's governance board. Is there a role on it that would use what I know? I said, tell me what you know. She said, patronage history. How institutions have funded the built environment over centuries. What models have worked and why? I said, that is exactly what the governance board lacks. She said, then, yes. I said, yes. She was quiet for a moment. She looked at her wine glass. She said, Werner. I said, yes. She said, I want to say something, and I need you to hear it as what it is, which is genuine and not managed. I said, I am listening. She said, you have been in my life for 20 years, and I have not known you. Not in the way I should have. I said, you have known me in the way that was available to you. She said, you let me. You let me know only what I chose to see. I said, yes. She said, why? I thought about this. I said, because a building does not announce its foundation. You see the building. The foundation is what makes the building possible. She said, that is a very Werner Hoffmann answer. I said, yes. She said, I am going to try to see the foundation. I said, good. That would be good. She joined the governance board in February. She has been the most practically useful member of the board since joining, which I say not as a compliment, but as an assessment, because I do not give compliments that are not assessments. Her knowledge of historical patronage models has been directly useful to 3 substantive decisions the board has made about the Foundation's program design. And her understanding of how institutions operate has made her a strong voice in the partnership negotiations with the university departments. The Hoffman Foundation for Architecture and Built Environment Education announced its first cohort of 8 fellows in April. The announcement was significant news in the German and Austrian architectural press and was picked up by several national outlets and by international architecture media. I attended the announcement event in Munich, which was held at the Technical University, in a room designed by the architect, Hans Dolgast, that I have always considered one of the finest examples of post-war German institutional design, and that I had spent some years advocating for its heritage listing. The fellows were introduced at the event. They were young people from Munich and Hamburg and Vienna and Graz, and they were each of them someone who would not have had access to this pathway without the Foundation, and this fact was visible in the quality of their attention when the program was described to them. I have spent 35 years in rooms where people are presented with architectural possibilities, and I know the look of someone who is seeing something for the first time that they had not previously believed was available to them. I saw this 8 times at the announcement event. I want to describe what it felt like to watch those 8 people in that room, because the feeling is the thing this whole story was pointing toward, and the feeling is the reason the Foundation exists. There was a young man from Hamburg, the son of a construction worker, who had been identified through the partnership with a regional polytechnic, where he had been studying construction management. His academic record in the structural analysis components of his course had been exceptional, and his portfolio of self-initiated design projects submitted as part of his Foundation application showed a quality of spatial thinking that his course of study had not been sufficiently testing. He was 23 years old, and he sat in the front row of the announcement event, and he listened with the full-body quality of attention that I have only seen in people who understand that what they are hearing is going to change the shape of their future. When the bursary terms were described, the 2-year supported program at TU Munich, the mentoring by practicing architects, the guaranteed placement at the end, he did not smile. He did not react. He simply went very still, which was the most significant reaction possible. After the event, when the formal presentations were finished and people were talking, he came to me. He had found out I was the founder, and he came directly, without the uncertainty that many young people would have had in that situation, with the directness of someone who has decided to say something real and has given himself permission to say it. He said, "Herr Hoffmann, I have been looking at your hospital in Leipzig since I was 17. I have been trying to understand the roof." He said, "I did not know who to ask." I said, "What is your question about the roof?" He said, "The junction between the long span and the lateral support structure. There is something happening there that I cannot find in any of the publications." I said, "Come and find me next week. I will show you the drawings." He said yes. He said it with a simplicity that contained everything. This is why the Foundation exists. Not as a legacy project, or a philanthropic gesture, or a strategic move in any dimension of the professional or personal story I have been telling you. It exists because that young man from Hamburg had been looking at a building I designed for 8 years and could not find anyone to answer his question. That gap is the gap the Foundation is designed to fill. And the filling of it is the work that matters. Valentina was at the event. She sat in the audience during the formal part, and she spoke with several of the fellows afterward, which was something she had organized on her own initiative, because she understood that the connection between the academic context she could provide and the professional trajectory the fellows were beginning was a useful one. She had prepared for these conversations with the seriousness she brought to professional preparation, and the conversations were good. On the way out of the event, she walked beside me down the steps of the Dolgast building, and she said, This is a significant thing, I said. It is a beginning. She said, no, I mean, she stopped. She said, standing in that room and seeing those 8 people and knowing that. She stopped again. She said, this is what the work is for. I said, yes. She said, I never understood that before. I mean, I understood it abstractly. But watching those 8 people, I said, yes. She said, I understand it now. I want to be honest about what that moment meant to me, because honesty is the discipline I have tried to maintain throughout this account. It meant something. Not the sentimentalized something of a father whose child has finally understood him, because that framing puts me at the center, and the center belongs to the 8 fellows. What it meant was simpler than that. It meant that the person beside me was now present to the same thing I was present to, and that shared presence was genuine, and that it had taken 23 years and an engagement dinner, and a press release and an April event in a Dolgast building to produce it. These are many steps for a single arrival. But the arrival was real, and real is the only kind that matters. The wedding was in June at a garden venue outside Vienna on a warm afternoon, and it was everything that summer weddings in Austria can be. She sat in the audience during the formal part, and she spoke with several of the fellows afterward, which was something she had organized on her own initiative, because she understood that the connection between the academic context she could provide and the professional trajectory the fellows were beginning was a useful one. She had prepared for these conversations with the seriousness she brought to professional preparation, and the conversations were good. On the way out of the event, she walked beside me down the steps of the Dolgast building, and she said, this is a significant thing. I said, it is a beginning. She said, no, I mean, she stopped. She said, standing in that room and seeing those 8 people and knowing that. She stopped again. She said, this is what the work is for. I said, yes. She said, I never understood that before. I mean, I understood it abstractly. But watching those 8 people, I said, yes. She said, I understand it now. The wedding was in June at a garden venue outside Vienna on a warm afternoon, and it was everything that summer weddings in Austria can be. I danced with Hannah. I spoke with Felix's mother, Frau Bergmann, who said several specific things about the foundation that demonstrated she had read about it carefully, and that her interest was genuine. She said, I have been thinking about how our foundation might support your work. She said, the cultural and the built environment have always been connected, and the connection has not been sufficiently explored in the funding landscape. I said, I agree. I said, let us find a time to discuss it properly. She said, yes. She said, I would like that. I want to describe the conversation with Frau Bergmann more fully, because it was a conversation that surprised me in a useful way. She had, in the months between the engagement dinner and the wedding, done what I had not expected her to do, which was to look closely at the foundation and at the professional context in which it was operating. She spoke about the specific challenge of diversifying architectural education in Austria, which she knew about from her cultural foundation's work with young artists from disadvantaged backgrounds, and she spoke about it with the practical intelligence of someone who has spent a long time in the space between cultural aspiration and institutional reality. She was not performing interest. She had formed genuine views, and she was sharing them. She also said at one point in the conversation the following, I owe you an apology. I looked at her. She said, at the engagement dinner, I smiled at Valentina's description of you and said how useful. She said, I should have asked who you actually were. I said, you had just met me. She said, yes, but you were clearly someone worth knowing, and I did not make the effort to know you. She said, I apologize for that. I said, you are very kind. She said, I am being accurate. She said it with a slight smile that told me she had heard that formulation before. I said, yes, accuracy is kind in the end. She said, I think that is true. The wedding reception was long, in the way that Austrian wedding receptions are long, which is to say, generously and without apology, and it produced the kind of evening that emerges when a group of people who are genuinely glad to be together in the same place are given sufficient time and sufficient wine and a warm evening and a garden. I had conversations I had not expected, and found myself glad of the unexpected quality of them. At some point in the reception, Valentina found me at the edge of the garden, where I was standing with a glass of wine and looking at the building that housed the venue, which was a 19th century country house that had been carefully preserved. and that had a specific quality of light through the windows in the late afternoon that I found consistently worth attending to. She stood beside me. She said, "What are you looking at?" I said, "The light through the east windows." She said, "What about it?" I said, "At this angle and this time of afternoon, the light becomes indirect before it becomes direct again. There is about 20 minutes in which the room inside those windows is lit from the reflected surface of the garden, rather than from the sun itself." She said, "How do you know that?" I said, "I have been here before. I reviewed the building for a client who was considering purchasing it some years ago." She said, "And you remembered the light?" I said, "I remember light." She said, "Yes." She said, "I know that about you now." She said, "I know more about you now than I did a year ago." I said, "Yes." She said, "I am going to continue knowing more." I said, "I hope so." She said, "Werner." I said, "Yes." She said, "I want to say something without it being managed." I said, "Go ahead." She said, "I'm glad you are my stepfather." She said, "I have been glad for a long time, and I have not said it, and I should have said it." I said, "You did not need to say it for it to be true." She said, "I know." She said, "But I'm saying it now." I said, "Thank you, Valentina." We stood at the edge of the garden for a while, looking at the light through the east windows, and at the garden going golden in the late afternoon, and at the party happening around us, with the warm, specific quality of people who are genuinely glad. It was a good evening. It was the kind of evening that a year makes possible when the year has contained things that needed to happen. I am writing this in the study of the Munich house on a September morning. The study is a room I have worked in for 22 years, since we bought the house, and it looks out over the small garden that Hannah has been developing, with the patient attention she brings to everything she finds worth developing. The garden in September is doing what gardens do in September, preparing its transition with the specific unperformed grace of something that does not need to be told when it is time to change. I find this quality in gardens and in buildings, both the quality of things that do what they do at the time they are supposed to do it, and that do not require management. The practice is well. We have taken on 2 new partners in the past year, both of them from the generation of architects who trained in the years when our work was at its most visible and who have arrived at the practice with a quality of professional seriousness that I find encouraging for the future. One of them, a woman from Leipzig, has been leading the hospital extension project with an approach to the structural aesthetic integration that has resolved a problem I had been looking at for 2 years without finding the resolution. This is the best possible news in a professional context, which is that the next generation has things to teach you. The foundation has its 8 fellows in their first year of the program. The preliminary feedback from the partner institutions is positive in the way that specific detail are more positive than general enthusiasm, which is to say the specific reports about the fellows' progress have the quality of people describing something that is actually working rather than something they have been asked to say is working. The young man from Hamburg has submitted his first structural project, and the lead professor at TU Munich has sent me a note about it that says what I would have said about it, which is that there is something there worth developing. Valentina has submitted her second contribution to the governance board, a paper on the guild system as an historical model for professional entry pathways, which is more specifically applicable to the Foundation's work than the first paper, and which demonstrates that she is thinking more precisely about the problem the more she is inside it. This is what I would expect from her. This is what the quality of her mind produces when it is genuinely engaged. I have a meeting tomorrow with Frau Bergmann about the potential connection between her cultural foundation and mine. I have been preparing for it in the way I prepare for meetings that I think will be genuinely productive, which is by thinking carefully about what I want to understand rather than about what I want to say. I expect the conversation will be good. I expect that from it will come the beginning of something that neither of us fully knows the shape of yet, which is the best possible starting point. My name is Werner Hoffmann. I am 68 years old, and I have been designing buildings for 35 years, and they stand in cities, and they hold up the things they are meant to hold up. I have been a stepfather for 20 years to a woman who is now 41 and who is a scholar and a governance board member, and who said at her own wedding that she was glad I was her stepfather. And I believe her. I have been a husband to Hannah for 22 years, and everything I have built has been in the context of that marriage, and the marriage is the structure that supports everything else. These are the things that are true. They are enough. They have always been enough. The light through the east windows of the country house outside Vienna was the light I remembered. The 8 fellows in the Dolgast room were the reason the foundation exists. The conversation at the edge of the garden was 20 years arriving at a form that both of us could hold. Everything holds. That has always been the point. Everything holds. I have been living for the past 35 years in the specific paradox of being someone whose work is entirely visible and whose person is largely invisible. Buildings are public objects. They stand in cities, and they are seen and they are judged by everyone who passes. The person who designed them is generally not visible in the building. This is correct. This is how it should be. The building is the thing, and the person is the process by which the thing came into existence, and the process is not what matters. What matters is whether the thing works, and whether it is honest, and whether it will still be there in 100 years, doing what it is supposed to do. The foundation is the same. It will still be there in 100 years, doing what it is supposed to do, long after I am gone, and long after any particular announcement, or press release, or engagement dinner conversation has been forgotten. It will be doing what it is supposed to do, because the structure is sound, and the endowment is adequate, and the governance is genuine, and the need it addresses is real, and will remain real. These are the factors that determine whether a foundation endures, not the founding story. Not the specific circumstances of the timing, the structure. My name is Werner Hoffmann. I am 68 years old, and I have been designing buildings for 35 years, and they stand, and they will continue to stand because the foundations are sound. I have been a stepfather for 20 years, and I am still a stepfather, because the relationship was built on presence and patience, and the specific consistency of someone who shows up and does what is required, regardless of whether anyone is keeping score. I have been a husband to Hannah for 22 years, and everything I have built has been in the context of that marriage. And I cannot separate the professional achievements from the personal ones, because they have been built in the same life by the same person, and the life is not divided into categories, even if the telling of it sometimes requires them. The Hoffmann Foundation has its 8 fellows. It has its governance board. It has its partnership agreements, and its endowment, and its founding chair, and its advisory member, who knows more about historical patronage models than anyone else on the committee, and who has been an unexpected and genuine addition to the work. The light through the east windows of the country house outside Vienna was exactly what I remembered it being. Everything is as it should be. Everything holds. That has always been the point. There is one more thing I want to tell you before I end this account, and it concerns my father. My father died in 2001 when I was 45, and the practice was 11 years old. And we had just completed the faculty building in Nuremberg. That was the first project I felt had fully expressed what we were trying to do. He did not live to see the university buildings or the hospitals or the concert halls. He did not live to see the architecture prize. He lived to see the practice established and growing, and he understood from his own professional life what it meant to have built something that worked. He came to Munich in the autumn of the year before he died, when he was already ill, and when the trip from Stuttgart was an effort, and I drove him around to see several of the projects I had completed in Munich over the previous years. We walked through one of the school libraries together on a Saturday morning when the school was closed, and I had borrowed the key from the headmistress. He walked slowly because his hips were giving him trouble, and he looked at everything with the specific attention of an engineer, the attention of a person who is seeing structure rather than surface. He did not say much. At the end, he said, "The load distribution in the main reading room." I said, "Yes." He said, "That is the problem." I said, "Yes." He said, "You solved it by." He looked at the ceiling. He said, "Ah." I said, "Yes." He said, "I would not have seen that." I said, "I learned it from someone at the ETH." He said, "Good." We were quiet for a moment. He said, "Werner." I said, "Yes." He said, This is what you were supposed to do. I said, I know. He said, I'm glad you knew. I said, you showed me at the kitchen table. He did not say anything more, but we both understood what he meant and what I meant. And the understanding was sufficient. He died in March of 2001. The faculty building in Nuremberg opened in May. He did not see it. I went to the opening, and I stood in the main atrium, which has a quality of light at midday that I had calculated, and that exceeded the calculation, and I stood in it, and I thought about him. I think about him still in buildings I have made that work in the way they were supposed to work, and in rooms where young people are learning to do what I did, and in the conversations with my stepdaughter that have become in the past year the conversations I did not know I was missing for 20 years. The best things take the time they take. My father understood this. The buildings understand this. The 8 fellows understand this in the way that people who are at the beginning of a long investment understand it, not yet from experience but from the quality of attention they are bringing to the beginning. I understand it. And Valentina is beginning to understand it, which is the most recent arrival on the list, and the one that I find on a September morning in Munich with the garden going golden outside the study window, the one that I hold with the most particular care. Everything holds. That has always been the point. And the point after 68 years is still the right point. I'm glad it is. I want to return briefly to the engagement dinner in November, because I have described it from the outside, and I want to describe it from the inside once more before closing. The room was warm, and the food was good, and the wine was appropriate. And the 22 people in it were doing what people do at formal celebratory occasions, which is to perform a version of themselves that is slightly more polished than their everyday version, more considered, more present to the social geometry of the occasion. I was doing this too in my own way, which is to say, I was being the most attentive and least self-announcing version of myself, the version that listens more than it speaks, and that is genuinely interested in whatever the person across from it has to say. I was genuinely interested. I am always genuinely interested in rooms. Rooms tell you things, the people in them tell you things, and the telling is interesting if you are paying the right quality of attention. I was in that room, aware of the Bergmans and of their specific social fluency, and of what it said about them. I was aware of Valentina moving through the room with the particular energy she had developed over years of managing academic environments, the energy of someone who is comfortable managing groups because she has been doing it professionally, and who brings this competence to social management as well. I was aware of Felix's careful attentiveness and of what it said about his character, that he was attending carefully to everyone in the room, and not just to the people he needed to impress. And I was aware of myself standing with a glass of wine I had not yet tasted, being introduced as the man who manages things at home, and of the specific quality of what I felt in that moment, which was not humiliation and not anger, but something more, like the recognition that a prediction I had been holding for some time had been confirmed. The prediction was not that Valentina would fail me specifically. The prediction was that the absence of inquiry would eventually produce this kind of moment, where the description that filled the absence would be inadequate in a way that was costly. The cost in this case was not to me. It was to Valentina, who had missed 20 years of understanding, someone who had been trying. In the way that I try, which is through presence, rather than announcement, to be known. I tasted the wine. It was good. I continued to be present in the room, and I thought about the press release and about what it was going to say and about the specific timing of December and about what December would produce. I was right about what it produced. The phone call on Tuesday morning confirmed it, and the dinner in Vienna confirmed it further, and the April event in the Dolgast room, and the June wedding, and the September meeting preparation with Frau Bergman have all continued to confirm it. What was absent is being filled. The filling is real. It is happening at the pace that real things happen, which is not the pace of resolution stories, but the pace of actual human beings arriving at actual understanding through the actual work of paying attention. I find this more satisfying than a faster version would be. The faster version would not be the right version, and the right version is the only one that matters. I have spent 35 years believing this about buildings, and it turns out it is also true about families. Everything holds. My name is Werner Hoffman, 68 years old. The buildings stand. The foundation is running. The garden outside the study window is preparing its September transition with the specific, unperformed grace of things that do not need to be told when it is time. Hana is somewhere in the house, and the house is the house it has always been, the structure that supports everything else. The foundation you cannot see from the visible life, but that makes the visible life possible. I have been called the man who manages things at home. It is not the worst description of what I have done here for 22 years. Things have been managed, and they have held. The foundation is the same thing applied to a larger scale. Structures that work, because the foundations are sound, because the load is distributed correctly, because the specific tolerance between what the structure can bear and what would break it has been understood and respected. Everything holds. That has always been the point. The Dogast room will still be there in 100 years. The 8 fellows will be practicing architects in 10. The conversations between Valentina and me will continue to improve because both of us are paying the right quality of attention now, and attention is the thing that makes improvement possible. These are sufficient facts. They are more than sufficient. They are everything.